The drums of Istanbul's palace grounds thunder like war, torches hiss in the cold night air, their flames reflected in the polished helmets of janissaries. In the center of the arena, a prisoner kneels, half naked, his wrists bound in iron. The roar of the crowd swells, but this is no battlefield. This is theater, and the script has already been written in blood. This was not Rome. This was not Carthage. This was the Ottoman Empire, in its forbidden hour, where humiliation and cruelty were staged as statecraft, and torture itself became entertainment. If you thought Ottoman history was only sultans and harems, stay with me. Because what happened in these arenas is far darker than you've ever been told. Before we descend into the shadows of these hidden arenas, make sure you subscribe for more history that schools won't touch. Drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from. I'd love to see how far our audience of hidden history explorers has reached. And if you think you know what empire was the most brutal in history, tell me below, because by the end of this video, you may change your answer. The scandal begins not in open daylight, but in whispered rumor. Travelers from Venice, Genoa, and France returned from Constantinople with stories that sounded more like nightmares than news. They spoke of arenas where men were not only executed, but broken, degraded, and humiliated as a form of spectacle. According to reports passed through European courts, these arenas were sometimes disguised as military drills, hunting pits, or royal celebrations. But the truth was darker. Prisoners of war, political traitors, and even nobles who fell out of favor were stripped not only of freedom, but of dignity. Imagine a condemned soldier forced to fight wild beasts, but not with weapons. Instead, he would be armed with nothing but his bare hands, his humiliation serving as the true entertainment. Or worse, he might be dressed in absurd costumes, mocked as the crowd jeered, before being torn apart by lions brought from North Africa. One Venetian ambassador wrote that in the 16th century, a janissary captain who betrayed his master was not executed swiftly. Instead, he was paraded in the arena, forced into a grotesque mock battle where his armor was replaced with women's garments. His death was not only physical, it was staged as ritual humiliation. And this was the forbidden secret of the Ottoman arenas. They were not simply places of death, but of psychological torture made public. The scandal was magnified by who watched. These were not commoners alone. Often, the audience included the Sultan himself, his viziers, and members of the royal harem, hidden behind lattice screens. For them, cruelty was not a shameful necessity of empire. It was an art form. The very air must have reeked of sweat, incense, and blood. The drums did not mark war but degradation. The crowd was not a mass of citizens, but of courtiers trained to smile as a man begged for mercy. His shield was shame. His battlefield, an arena designed not for glory, but for disgrace. What made the Ottomans cultivate such spectacles? Why did humiliation become as important as execution? To answer that, we must step beyond the arena walls and into the cultural and psychological heart of the Ottoman court. To understand the forbidden Ottoman arenas, we must step away from the blood-soaked sand and into the palaces and prayer halls of Istanbul. The Ottomans were not mindless butchers. They were strategists of power, carefully cultivating an image of invincibility. And in their world, humiliation was not an accident of cruelty. It was a deliberate political weapon. The empire itself had been forged by war. From the 14th century onward, the Ottomans expanded across the Balkans, the Middle East, and North Africa. Every conquest brought with it new prisoners, rebels, and rivals. But executions alone could not secure loyalty. Death silences a man, but shame echoes in memory. A swift execution could make a martyr. A public humiliation could make a warning. That was the calculus of the Ottoman state. The Ottomans inherited this principle from a long tradition. In the Byzantine arenas, rebels were paraded before their deaths. In Central Asian steppe culture, traitors were often mocked before execution. The Ottomans fused these traditions and elevated them into something more theatrical, more psychological. The arena became a mirror of empire. To the Sultan, it showed his absolute authority. To the janissaries, it displayed the punishment for disloyalty. To foreign ambassadors, it whispered a warning. This is what awaits those who challenge us. Every scream, every jeer, every tear served as part of a performance designed to remind the world who ruled. But humiliation was not only political, it was cultural and spiritual. In Ottoman Islam, concepts of honor, purity, and shame were woven deeply into life. To be stripped naked, forced into absurdity, or paraded before women was not just physical dishonor, it was spiritual annihilation. The arenas exploited this psychology mercilessly. Victims were not merely killed, they were defiled before death. Their memory was poisoned so that even their families would carry shame. A blade ends a life. A spectacle ends a legacy. The setting itself amplified this cruelty. Ottoman arenas were not as grand as Rome's Colosseum, but they were intimate. Some were palace courtyards, others converted hippodromes. Torches threw shadows across marble walls. Incense masked the stench of blood. Drums and flutes mingled with the howls of captives. A condemned pasha, once a commander of armies, forced to crawl before eunuchs who mocked him. His velvet robes replaced with rags, his jeweled sword snapped before his eyes. The crowd did not see a general. They saw a broken man, a lesson carved into flesh. And then there was the role of the harem. Behind gilded screens, the women of the Sultan's household often watched. For them, these arenas were not entertainment but education. They learned the cost of disobedience. They saw the empire's enemies reduced to dust. Some sources whisper that even the Sultan's concubines were made to mock prisoners, their laughter a cruel chorus that sealed the victim's dishonor. This fusion of power, sex, and violence was deliberate. By intertwining them, the Ottomans reminded their subjects that the Sultan was not merely ruler. He was master of both body and soul. Foreigners were stunned. Venetian envoys, accustomed to duels and gallows, described Ottoman spectacles as theatre of degradation. French chroniclers wrote of punishments so vile, so obscene that the tongue burns to repeat them. And yet, within the empire, these rituals were not considered obscene. They were rituals of order. Just as the Sultan led prayers as caliph, he also presided over humiliation as sovereign. This paradox defined the Ottomans, a state both devout and decadent, both disciplined and indulgent. In their faith, the Sultan was shadow of God. In their arenas, he was god of shadows. Why did humiliation matter so much? Because the Ottoman court itself was a furnace of rivalry. Viziers plotted against each other. Brothers vied for the throne. Eunuchs wielded whispers like daggers. To survive, one needed not only power, but immunity from shame. The arena was a reminder. No man, however high, was untouchable. A grand vizier could become a clown overnight. A victorious general could die dressed in mockery. In the empire of the Sultan, honor was not earned. It was granted and could be stripped in a heartbeat. This cultural backdrop explains why the forbidden arena tortures were not hidden mistakes, but systemic rituals. They were as much a part of Ottoman statecraft as treaties and wars. If humiliation was the language of power, then the arenas were its grammar. But who created this system? Who ensured that cruelty was not only allowed but celebrated? To answer that, we must meet the figures who stood behind the curtain. The sultans, viziers, and court officials who orchestrated these forbidden spectacles. Every cruelty has its architect, and in the Ottoman Empire, the arenas of humiliation were not born in chaos. They were crafted from the top down. From the earliest sultans, power was consolidated not just by victory in war, but by fear within the palace walls. And no ruler embodied this better than Mehmed II, the conqueror of Constantinople. According to chroniclers, Mehmed not only stormed Byzantium's walls, but also stormed the traditions of power. He understood that conquest was not enough. To hold an empire, you needed to orchestrate loyalty through fear. The arena was his tool, the court his audience. Mehmed's successors refined it further. What began as executions evolved into ritualized humiliations. The machinery of cruelty depended on three pillars of the Ottoman court: the Sultan, who approved the spectacles; the viziers, who staged them as political theatre; the janissaries, who enforced them with blade and drum. Each had a role, and each needed the others. The Sultan provided legitimacy. His presence turned an execution into a message. If the ruler himself watched a man stripped of honor, the entire empire watched through him. The viziers supplied cunning. They knew how to twist humiliation into politics. A rival was not simply executed. He was ridiculed in the exact way that destroyed his faction's pride. The janissaries supplied muscle and rhythm. They carried out the degradations, but they also turned them into performance. Their chants, their drums, their jeers transform cruelty into spectacle. A dagger kills a body. A ritual kills a reputation. Take, for example, the case of Ibrahim Pasha, the once beloved Grand Vizier of Suleiman the Magnificent. According to Venetian accounts, Ibrahim was stripped of his honors, paraded in humiliation, and strangled not in privacy, but under the eyes of those he once commanded. His fall was not only physical, it was staged as a moral collapse. He went from vizier of victory to spectacle of disgrace. This was no accident. This was the system. The system also thrived because of the Ottoman principle of fratricide. From the 15th century, it was law that a sultan could execute his brothers to secure the throne. This brutal tradition ensured that succession was bathed in blood. But the method of death mattered. A quick strangling preserved dignity. A staged humiliation erased it. Some princes were dressed as fools, mocked by janissaries, before being quietly silenced. To the court, this sent an unmistakable message. Even the blood of Osman, the dynasty's founder, was not immune to degradation. Blood gave you the throne, but shame could take it away. The harem too played a role in this rise. The women closest to the sultan, his mother, concubines, and favorites, were power brokers. They whispered names into his ear, suggested who should fall, and sometimes demanded that disgrace accompany death. European envoys whispered that women of the harem sometimes requested humiliations, not merely executions against their rival supporters. This turned the arenas into a theatre of rivalry, not just between men, but between the women who ruled the empire's most secret chambers. Foreigners who witnessed these spectacles were left aghast. Venetian diplomat Bartolomeo Contarini described punishments staged with such artifice, as though cruelty itself were a play. French envoys reported being invited to palace arenas not to feast, but to watch prisoners mocked before death. The Ottomans wanted outsiders to carry these stories home. Fear was an export, and humiliation was its currency. But why did the system endure for centuries? Because it worked. The empire stretched across 3 continents, ruled over Christians, Muslims and Jews, Arabs, Turks and Slavs. Unity through law was fragile. Unity through fear was stronger. The arenas, the humiliations, the forbidden tortures, they all reminded the empire's millions that rebellion was not only futile, it was shameful. Fear binds a man's hands. Shame binds his memory. Still, the system was not invincible. By making humiliation its language of control, the court planted the seeds of paranoia. Viziers feared disgrace more than death. Janissaries, once loyal, began to resent their role as executioners. Even sultans, surrounded by whispers and suspicion, became prisoners of their own cruelty. And as history shows, every system of power that feeds on fear eventually turns inward. The rise of the system had made humiliation into law, cruelty into policy, and spectacle into survival. But now, we must step into the forbidden acts themselves, the tortures so obscene, so theatrical, that chroniclers struggled to write them without shame. One common spectacle was the mock battle. Prisoners, often captured rebels or traitorous janissaries, were forced to fight each other in the sand. But unlike Roman gladiators, they were given no real weapons. Instead, they fought with wooden staves, blunted blades, or sometimes with nothing at all. The crowd's delight was not in the kill, but in the humiliation. A once proud warrior, reduced to flailing in desperation, was a sight carefully crafted to degrade. And if the crowd grew restless, the janissaries unleashed animals, dogs, bulls, or even lions imported from Africa, turning the mockery into massacre. Rome gave glory to the gladiator. The Ottomans gave shame to the condemned. Another ritual was the costumed degradation. Captured nobles or disfavored officials were stripped of their silks and redressed in absurd parody. Some sources claim they were clothed as jesters or even in women's garments before being paraded across the arena. For a culture obsessed with honor, this was annihilation. A general who once commanded armies was now mocked as a clown before his peers. Sometimes he was forced to perform dances under jeers, or to serve wine to the very guards who would later kill him. This inversion of roles was not random. It was carefully staged, a form of symbolic execution of dignity before the body itself was taken. The most feared of all, however, was the ritual humiliation of janissaries. The Janissary Corps, once the Sultan's loyal guard, became a restless and dangerous force. When one of their own turned traitor, punishment had to be unforgettable. Accounts describe traitorous Janissaries being bound, forced to kneel, and mocked by their brothers in arms. Their uniforms were shredded, their plumes torn off, their belts snapped. Sometimes they were made to kiss the boots of younger recruits, an inversion of hierarchy that killed pride before flesh. And then came the final cruelty. Death not by sword, but by slow strangulation with a bowstring while the drums thundered. The body fell silent, but the shame lingered. The Janissary's armor was steel. His true shield was honor. Once stripped, he was already dead. But not all spectacles ended in death. Some ended in living mutilation. There are whispers, recorded by European travelers, of prisoners being publicly castrated, their manhood symbolically erased to mark eternal disgrace. These men were then sent to the palace as eunuchs, their very existence a reminder that the Sultan's power extended over body, soul, and lineage. In other cases, noses or ears were cut, not for justice, but for display. The mutilated were paraded as living warnings, the shame carved into their flesh for all to see. To Western observers, this was barbarity. To the Ottoman court, it was pedagogy. Even darker still were the forced spectacles of intimacy. Chroniclers hint that prisoners were coerced into acts designed to degrade them before mixed audiences of courtiers and hidden harem women. The details are shrouded in euphemism, but the purpose is clear: to turn the victim's body into theatre, his humiliation into entertainment. It was here that power, sex, and violence merged into one forbidden ritual, the very kind of practice so shocking that later chroniclers whispered of it only in fragments. The arena was not about lust. It was about laughter at another man's ruin. Some spectacles reached the grotesque. Ottoman chronicles mention rebels being sewn into animal skins and thrown to wild dogs. Others were tied to bulls, dragged across courtyards until their bodies broke. For the crowd, this was not only horror, it was affirmation. They saw the empire's enemies reduced to beasts, erased from the order of men. Yet perhaps the most chilling act was the ritual of silence. After hours of mockery, degradation and jeers, the final moment came not with noise, but with stillness. The Sultan would raise his hand, the drums would stop, the crowd would freeze, and in that silence, the condemned would be strangled. Quick, efficient, merciless. This silence was the final humiliation. No cheers, no glory, only erasure. A life ended not with triumph or resistance, but with indifference. Noise is rebellion. Silence is obedience. The arena ended in silence. These forbidden acts, too sick for many chroniclers to describe, were not random outbursts of cruelty. They were carefully staged performances. Each humiliation carried a message about power, loyalty, and the futility of defiance. And in staging them, the Ottomans turned their arenas into a school of fear. But cruelty leaves scars. What did these spectacles do to the rulers who ordered them, to the janissaries who carried them out, to the harem that watched from behind the screens? To understand, we must enter the psychology of the system itself. Cruelty does not emerge from nothing. Behind the Ottoman arena spectacles was not only politics but psychology. To understand why rulers staged humiliations too obscene for chroniclers to repeat, we must enter the minds of those who watched, ordered, and carried them out. At the heart stood the Sultan. He was Padishah, shadow of God on earth. His authority was both divine and absolute, but that very absoluteness created a prison of paranoia. Every brother was a rival, every vizier a threat, every janissary a potential assassin. In such a world, the Sultan could never simply punish, he had to annihilate. And annihilation meant not just death, but disgrace. For the Sultan, humiliation was insurance. A dead rival might inspire loyalty in his followers. A humiliated rival left no loyalty to claim, only shame. Fear protects the throne. Shame poisons memory. But there was more than strategy. There was also obsession. Some sultans, like Selim the Grim, were consumed by suspicion. He executed not only rivals, but even scholars and poets whose words seemed too daring. For such rulers, humiliation became a way to confirm their power, not just over the body, but over the very dignity of men. Others, like Murad IV, were infamous for sudden fits of cruelty. He was known to wander the streets of Istanbul in disguise, striking down drunkards with his own sword. For him, the arenas were an extension of his personal psychology, a stage to channel his rage, his fear, and his need to remind the world that he alone controlled life and death. The viziers, too, had their psychology. They lived in a furnace of rivalry, where one misstep could mean disgrace. For them, orchestrating humiliations was a way of survival. By humiliating their enemies publicly, viziers protected themselves. A rival mocked in front of the sultan could not rise again. A rebel reduced to laughter could not gather followers. But in doing so, the viziers also became addicted to humiliation. Power was not only about wealth or armies, it became about the ability to strip another man of his dignity. Gold buys silence. Shame buys obedience. For centuries, they were the empire's elite core, recruited as children through the Devshirme levy, raised as soldiers loyal only to the sultan. But they too bore scars. Torn from their families, converted, disciplined, humiliation was their foundation. When they mocked prisoners in the arena, they were reenacting their own past. The jeers they once endured as children, the stripping away of their identities, now they inflicted the same on others. Cruelty became a cycle. Some janissaries, travellers reported, laughed with unnatural fervour during humiliations, perhaps because in mocking others, they buried their own shame. The harem, too, cannot be ignored. For women confined behind screens, forbidden from open politics, the arena was a rare glimpse of power. Watching enemies degraded was not only entertainment, it was reassurance that their own position was safe. Some concubines even encouraged humiliations, using them as weapons in palace intrigues. A rival faction could be destroyed not only by death, but by ensuring its leader died in ridicule. Psychologically, the arena gave the powerless, women, eunuchs, even servants, a chance to taste the thrill of dominance. Behind the screens, laughter was not only cruel, it was cathartic. If you cannot rule, you can at least watch a ruler fall. Yet beneath all of this lies the darkest truth. Cruelty itself became addictive. Each humiliation had to be more shocking than the last. Each spectacle had to surpass the previous one in obscenity. A system that thrived on fear had to constantly raise the stakes. This explains why European chroniclers wrote that the acts they saw were beyond the tongue to tell. The Ottomans themselves may not have thought them unusual, but to outsiders, they looked like madness. And perhaps madness is the right word, for when humiliation becomes normal, empathy dies. The rulers no longer see men. They see puppets for their performance. In this way, the arenas were not only spectacles for the court, they were mirrors of the empire's psyche. They revealed the paranoia of the sultan, the rivalries of the viziers, the scars of the janissaries, the hunger for power in the harem. Every humiliation was both punishment and confession, a confession of how fragile the Ottoman system truly was. The empire's strength was fear. Its weakness was the need to prove it. But fear cannot hold forever. Humiliation cuts deep, not only into victims, but into the society that inflicts it. As the arenas grew more grotesque, they planted seeds of unrest. The janissaries who mock today might be mocked tomorrow. Viziers who staged humiliations for the sultan might one day taste them themselves. And eventually, the cycle of cruelty would spiral into rebellion, assassination, and collapse. To see how the system cracked, we must leave psychology and step into consequence. By the 16th and 17th centuries, the Ottoman arena humiliations were no longer isolated spectacles. They had become woven into the empire's political fabric, and the consequences spread far beyond the palace walls. The first realm touched was politics. Within the Ottoman court, humiliation became a weapon sharper than steel. Viziers orchestrated spectacles not merely to please the sultan, but to destroy rivals. A quick death ended a man's life. A public disgrace ended his faction. Consider the downfall of high officials like Grand Vizier Sokolu, Mehmed Pasha's successors. When they fell, their enemies ensured not only their execution, but their ridicule. Their robes were stripped, their names mocked, their families shamed. For decades afterward, their households carried the invisible stain of humiliation. Death removes a man, disgrace removes his memory. But this constant use of humiliation had a cost. It bred paranoia in politics. No vizier could ever feel safe. Even loyalty could not guarantee dignity. The arena hung over every courtier like a shadow, turning the Ottoman bureaucracy into a theatre of fear. The consequences also reached the military. The janissaries, Once the most disciplined soldiers in the world became increasingly unsettled. Forced to humiliate their own, they saw firsthand how fragile their honor was. Some accepted it, laughing as they degraded traitors, but others grew resentful. They began to believe that the Sultan no longer trusted them, that their loyalty was rewarded not with glory, but with suspicion. By the 17th century, this resentment boiled into Janissary revolts. In Istanbul's streets, the same men who once jeered at condemned prisoners now shouted against their sultan. Cruelty had bound them for a time, but eventually, it broke them. Humiliation unites against one enemy, but divides against all others. Even religion felt the impact. The Ottomans prided themselves on being the protectors of Islam. They built mosques, sponsored scholars, and carried the title of caliph. Yet behind palace walls, they staged spectacles of obscenity. Imams were divided. Some turned a blind eye, justifying humiliation as a form of justice. Others whispered that these acts defiled the very soul of the empire. European observers, eager to portray Islam as barbaric, seized upon the rumors. They described the Sultan's court as a paradox, pious in prayer, perverse in punishment. This contradiction eroded the moral image of the Ottoman state. To outsiders, it became the empire of both mosques and mockeries. Diplomacy, too, was shaped by the arenas. Foreign ambassadors were sometimes invited, or forced, to watch humiliations. For the Sultan, this was deliberate theatre, a warning carried back to Europe. For the envoys, it was horror. Venetian reports describe punishments too vile for pen to capture. French envoys wrote of being unable to look without shame. And yet, the message was received. Stories of Ottoman cruelty spread across Europe, cementing the empire's reputation as both powerful and terrifying. Fear became its diplomatic currency, but also its stigma. Respect may win allies. Fear wins silence. The wider population of Istanbul and beyond also felt the ripple. News of humiliations spread quickly. Coffee houses buzzed with tales of a vizier mocked, a janissary broken, a rebel dragged in rags. For ordinary citizens, these stories were both thrilling and chilling. They reminded the people that no man, however mighty, was safe. But they also planted cynicism. If rulers could degrade their own so openly, what dignity was left for common men? Over time, cruelty corroded respect. Subjects obeyed, yes, but increasingly out of fear, not loyalty. Even Ottoman culture absorbed the influence. Poets, unable to speak openly, used allegory to describe humiliation. Plays performed in shadow theatres mocked fallen viziers through puppets. Their disgrace turned into whispered comedy. This was dangerous. Satire itself could invite punishment, but it showed that cruelty had entered the bloodstream of Ottoman society. The arenas had become not just a state ritual, but a cultural symbol of fragility and fear. When cruelty becomes culture, collapse is not far. The deepest consequence, however, was unseen. By turning humiliation into policy, the empire hollowed itself from within. Viziers trusted no one. Janissaries turned restless. Citizens obeyed without loyalty. Even sultans became prisoners of suspicion. Cruelty preserved the empire in the short term, but eroded it in the long. The forbidden Ottoman arena tortures were never just about prisoners. They were about the empire itself, about teaching fear, enforcing obedience, and silencing dissent. But in doing so, the Ottomans bound their empire to the very poison they used to control it. Fear builds walls, but it also cracks them, and those cracks would widen. For every empire built on humiliation, there comes a day when the spectacle turns against its master. No empire can feed forever on humiliation without tasting its own poison. For the Ottomans, the forbidden arena tortures that once secured obedience eventually ignited rebellion. The performances of fear became performances of collapse. The first cracks appeared in the Janissary Corps. For centuries, they had been the Sultan's loyal servants, raised from childhood, bound by discipline. But by the 17th century, they had grown restless. No longer an elite fighting force, they had become a powerful political faction, and they resented the role humiliation had forced them into. Executioners of their own brothers, participants in degrading spectacles. When pay was delayed, or when a sultan demanded reforms, the Janissaries no longer obeyed. They rioted, they stormed palace gates, they overturned food stalls and demanded blood. Ironically, the very soldiers who once mocked prisoners in the arena now dragged viziers through the streets. humiliating them in public before killing them. The weapon of shame had turned against the state. He who teaches mockery will one day be mocked. Sultans, too, became prisoners of their own cruelty. Take Osman Seo, who tried to reform the Janissaries after his disastrous campaign in Poland. In 1622, the soldiers revolted. They stormed the palace, seized their sultan, and dragged him through the streets. According to chroniclers, Osman was spat upon, mocked, and finally strangled by his own guards. This was humiliation reversed. The ruler who presided over spectacles of shame became their victim. The stage of cruelty had consumed its master. The throne that commands humiliation sits on quicksand. Powerful women like Kosum Sultan, once the invisible hands behind humiliations, became targets of revenge. Kosum herself was strangled in her chambers in 1651, her body hidden in shame. The harem that had once laughed at others' downfall now drowned in its own. The poison of humiliation spared no one. Not soldier, not vizier, not concubine. By the 18th century, the empire was visibly cracking. The arenas themselves were less frequent, but the psychology of humiliation persisted. Sultans executed brothers, viziers plotted betrayals, janissaries rioted. But what had once inspired fear now bred contempt. Subjects obeyed less out of loyalty than out of habit. Foreigners, once terrified by tales of Ottoman cruelty, now mocked the empire as the sick man of Europe. The weapon of fear had dulled. Terror burns bright, but it consumes its own flame. The ultimate breaking point came in the 19th century with the auspicious incident of 1826. By then, the Janissaries had become so rebellious that Sultan Mahmud II decided to eliminate them altogether. Cannons were fired into their barracks. Thousands were slaughtered. The very core that once staged humiliations for the Sultan was wiped out in a massacre of its own. It was as though the empire finally destroyed the mirror that had reflected its darkest self. What do we see in this downfall? A system built on humiliation can dominate for centuries, but eventually it collapses under the weight of its own cruelty. The Ottoman Empire did not fall in one moment, nor in one battle. It crumbled slowly, poisoned from within by the very tactics it had used to control others. Every spectacle of shame, every mockery, every arena of degradation carved another crack in the empire's foundation. By teaching its people that honor could be stolen at will, the Ottomans created a society where no one trusted loyalty and everyone feared tomorrow. An empire that mocks its subjects eventually becomes a mockery itself. The arenas were silenced, the torches burned out, but the memory of those humiliations lived on, in chronicles, in whispers, in the scars of history. And even today, the legacy of the forbidden Ottoman arenas reminds us of a universal truth. Cruelty may control the body, but it corrodes the soul of the ruler who wields it. When the last arenas fell silent and the final torches burned out, the Ottoman Empire tried to bury its darkest spectacles. Records were destroyed, chroniclers muted their pens, and official histories spoke more of mosques and victories than of humiliations. But memory is not so easily erased. Whispers of the forbidden tortures survived, in travellers' accounts, in rumours, in European pamphlets that painted the Ottomans as barbaric tyrants. The empire that once ruled 3 continents now found itself trapped in its own reputation. Powerful, yes, but feared for cruelties too obscene to speak aloud. A sword cuts the flesh. A story cuts forever. European writers seized on these stories. Venetian envoys, French chroniclers, and English diplomats spread tales of humiliations that shocked their audiences back home. Some exaggerated, turning rumour into propaganda. Others recorded with grim fascination. But all agreed on one thing. The Ottoman court had fused cruelty and theatre in ways that defied comprehension. In Europe's imagination, the terrible Turk became a symbol not just of military threat, but of moral corruption. The legacy of the arenas lived on not in Ottoman pride, but in European fear and contempt. To frighten your enemy is victory. To disgust him is exile from memory. Within the empire, the memory was more complicated. For ordinary Ottomans, stories of humiliations lingered as warnings. Parents told children, obey or end like the disgraced. Coffeehouse storytellers wove tales of fallen viziers, mocking janissaries, and sultans who silenced men with a gesture. Yet as the centuries passed, pride in empire clashed with shame. The Ottomans wanted to remember their conquests, their mosques, their art, not the arenas of humiliation. The darker chapters faded into silence, spoken of only in whispers. A people forgets what it cannot forgive. But for us, centuries later, the forbidden Ottoman arenas carry a lesson larger than empire. They remind us that cruelty is never just cruelty. It is a political language, a psychological tool, a performance stage for power. And like all performances, it demands escalation, until the spectacle destroys its actors. Modern history is filled with echoes. Dictators who stage public trials, regimes that humiliate opponents on television, leaders who confuse fear with loyalty. They walk the same path that Ottomans once did, power that humiliates. Today is power that collapses tomorrow. Behind every spectacle of shame was a human face, the condemned janissary who once believed in honor, the vizier who rose to greatness only to be paraded in rags, the concubine who laughed behind the screen, not knowing she too might one day be strangled. Their stories remind us that humiliation destroys not only its victims, but its witnesses. To watch cruelty and do nothing is to let it carve scars into the soul of a society. A man mocked is forgotten. A people who mock become what they hate. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed in the early 20th century, it was remembered for both glory and shadow. Its mosques still rise above Istanbul. Its calligraphy still adorns Qur'ans. Its laws and culture shape centuries of history. But beneath the grandeur, there remains a darker legacy. The arenas where cruelty was staged as spectacle, where shame was sharpened into a weapon, where humiliation was considered more enduring than death. The forbidden Ottoman arenas remind us that no empire, no ruler, no nation is immune to the temptation of power through degradation. But history shows us that this path always ends the same way. In rebellion, collapse, and disgrace, empires die not when they are defeated, but when they defeat themselves. Tonight, we have walked through firelit courtyards, heard the jeers of janissaries, and seen men stripped not only of life, but of honor. We have seen how humiliation became law, how cruelty became culture, and how fear became the very language of empire. And we have seen how, in the end, that language turned against its master. So what remains? A warning. The Ottoman arenas are gone, but their lesson endures. A society that thrives on humiliation cannot escape its shadow. If this journey into the forbidden history of the Ottoman Empire unsettled you, remember, this is only one chapter in humanity's long, dark story. Subscribe for more hidden history that textbooks won't teach. Comment below, which empire do you think hid the darkest scandals? And share this video with someone who believes power always protects its master, because history whispers another truth. Cruelty always comes home.